So I'm going to talk about VCS and their remarkable use of CCM and RPM program offered by HealthSnap. And the first thing we'll look at is how engaged their patients are. To get patients engaged, one way to monitor that is what is their transmission index. So if they're involved with remote patient monitoring and they have a device at home, let's say the blood pressure cuff, how often they're using that blood pressure cuff and the data is being received by the portal, that reflects engagement in a sense. We call that transmission index. And when we look across our thousands of patients across our portal, in general, as transmission index increases, patient improvements increase in whether it be systolic pressure, diastolic pressure, pulse pressure, mean arterial pressure, whatever we're looking at, glucose. So what we see with hypertensive patients is that those in the lowest quartile of data transmission, which is about 30 to 49%, they improve by about 6.8 points in systolic pressure, which is still really good. Those that are around 50 to 66%, so half to two-thirds of the time on the transmitting data, they do really well, over 8-point reduction in systolic pressure. If you get up around two-thirds of the time, 66% to 81% transmission index, that's really what we're striving for, because that's significantly better than the others, and that's about a 9-point reduction in systolic pressure. And of course, the group that is the most engaged, patients that are in the quartile of data transmission index of 81 to 100%, they typically show a 10-point reduction in systolic pressure. There's this direct relationship that we see between transmission index and what we see with the patient improvements. And the same thing goes, whether it be systolic pressure, mean arterial pressure, et cetera. And what we find is that the mean arterial pressure improvement for VCS was around 7 points, which is actually better than what we're seeing in primary care, what we're seeing typically as an average in nephrology, and what we're seeing typically an average in other cardiology groups and multidisciplinary groups. And we believe the transmission index has a lot to do with that, because when we look at the average cardiology transmission index, it's really close. It's 67% data transmission for blood pressure. Multidisciplinary groups is 61%, nephrology at 68%, and primary care at about 64%. VCS is a transmission index right up there around 70%. So their patients are highly engaged, and that has to do with the good dissemination of the program to patients from the provider bringing up the program with the patient and keeping in communication with them, and of course the clinical staff reaching out and keeping those patients engaged. All those things work sort of like surround sound around a patient to keep them engaged. The other thing that we see is that about 1/3 of the patients that were uncontrolled at baseline, and there was a high number of patients that were uncontrolled, over 4,000 patients that at home in ambulatory conditions were uncontrolled, where in the office, many of them may have presented as in control. So it shows that masked uncontrolled hypertension phenomenon, which is where patients in the office are presenting higher than they actually are at home with their blood pressure. Well, about 1/3 of them now went from baseline of their average 7 blood pressure measures being over 130 and or over 80, to now having their systolic pressure under 130 and their diastolic under 80. So to be considered uncontrolled, they can have either the systolic at 130 or higher or the diastolic at 80 or higher. But then to get control, they have to have both under those numbers, which is pretty difficult to do, especially that 80 diastolic for a lot of patients. And we saw that the VCS was able to get 1/3, 32.3%, essentially 1/3 of their patient population in the control range. And 2/3 of them, 67%, lowered their systolic pressure, and exactly the same 67% of them lowered their diastolic pressure. When we look at the actual numbers, systolic pressure in this group was lowered by just about 10 points, diastolic pressure by 5.5 points, and pulse pressure by about 4 points. And this was highly significant at the P less than 0.0001. So that means that what we're seeing here is not a fluke. When we look at the subset of patients with stage 2 hypertension, there were almost 2,400 patients that presented with stage 2. That means over 140 or over 90 diastolic. To get under stage 2, they had to get the systolic under 140 and the diastolic under 90. And more than half, 58% of the patients are now no longer in the stage 2 range. 74% of them improved systolic pressure, and 73% improved diastolic pressure, which is excellent. When we take a look at the numbers in the stage 2 patients, systolic went down by 14.5 points. Diastolic went down by just about 8 points,